else in architecture have a look at this, or do we need to go do an investigation?
I see.
And Brendan has a hard stop at the half-hour mark, so I'm going to go ahead and just let's move that to the front, and we can just quickly hit that real quick since you already brought it up. Let's do that.
So basically, as I was looking at the externalizing of the cloud provider work that we're doing, it looks like it's going to move out to be a container running in the cluster somewhere. That's the design that I saw, which means that it's not going to be able to access the metadata server that is present in all clouds for information like IP address of nodes and stuff like that. Has anybody else looked at the design? And I think there's going to be performance considerations as a result, because calls to a cloud API are inherently slower than hitting a metadata server. Has anybody looked at the design for externalizing the cloud, or should we have them come present at architecture?
Actually, I think it would be great to have them come present at SIG Architecture.
Okay. Has anybody else looked before I go and talk to them and say, hey, could you come present? I don't want to get them like from two angles or anything.
I have not looked at this aspect of it.
Yeah, I haven't either.
Okay.
I've been in the discussions, but this is something that's been going on for so long. I think a refresh look into this would be really smart, actually.
So
Okay.
Just as a question, the looking at the metadata server is like to get node level information, or
to get like node level IP and instance name and that kind of stuff.
I see.
I'm already in those meetings. I'll take care of coordinating that.
Okay, thanks, Jason. That's all I wanted to have.
I think it's great. I think this might be a thing to suggest that having them pull it together as a KEP would be really useful, just to sort of have a document written, or take their documents that they already have, and we can, because this is by definition something that's going to cross a bunch of different SIGs, just the way we have SIG structured right now.
And we converted the cloud provider, the original cloud provider proposal, to a KEP. So do you want a new KEP, or to extend the old KEP with this level of detail?
Probably I'm sorry, my mistake. So then probably extend it with this level of detail.
Okay.
Or at least go over the design. Yeah. I with the nitty gritty details, I don't want to talk without them here necessarily, but running it on cluster is different. I don't know. Let's talk about it.
Yes.
They're on.
Yeah. So we should try to get that scheduled. So also coming up in the schedule, cluster API. And those folks trying to work on making the cluster lifecycle tools more portable, they're interested in feedback on the API to make sure it follows conventions and things like that. So they requested to come on the next office hours meeting in 2 weeks. So I don't know if we have time to do both that and cloud provider, but I would also be fine with scheduling cloud provider during a regular meeting if we need to.
Yeah.
Did we decide the API review stuff? I think we thought was going to be kind of a thing on its own. Did we? I can't remember what decision we came to on whether we should review APIs at this meeting or have a like API review thing.
It will be at this meeting unless that proves not viable.
Okay, I suspect that that's going to be a big enough task that it'll consume all of this time, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm hoping that that is not the case, but we'll see, yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's go to the first action item, or the first thing on the agenda, which was API group name conventions and the role of domains and architectural layers, components, and group names. I'm not sure who brought this, but somebody speak up to that.
Well, I didn't add all the stuff around it, but I did bring the specific PR.
I added the stuff around it. So I guess this PR is asking for API approval. An API group name was suggested that I found surprising. I actually went to go look at what group names we're actually using at the API conventions to see what guidance it provides. Sadly, the guidance is lacking in this area. It just says that we reserve the empty group, which is the original core V1, all the single word groups like apps, and anything .k8s.io / whatever. So this definitely falls into that latter pattern, but there's no further guidance about how deep hierarchy should go or what, how the group should be named, like what information should you be trying to convey in the name. We have, so I pulled up the list of existing groups. There's a link in the notes doc there. Let me see. I'm not going to present it, but you can click on the link. So we do have things, unfortunately, like all kinds of variants. We have admission registration.k8s.io. That's admission registration, all one word with no punctuation. We have we had admission.k8s.io. We have apps. We have authentication.k8s.io. We have authorization.k8s.io. We have rbac.authorization.k8s.io. And, it looks like the direction we're going is, we started out with the one word groups like apps and batch and extensions. And most of the newer groups are .k8s.io, but most of them are one word .k8s.io. And most of them are the domain rather than the architectural layer or component.
I will say that the novelty of the admission registration and admission, those were explicit because those are part of the machinery of admission, not actual admission. And so we wouldn't want someone to be confused that those two were like actual admission plugins themselves. That's like here's the list of admission is in the admission group. Admission registration is how you register, but that's a background detail. So this is really the first one where we've actually talked about a group specifically now that we have admission, where we could make up a scheme for it. Like
the RBAC one is similar. I mean, it's authorization, not admission. But I'm not super excited about this pattern, I would have to say.
About the dot pattern?
Yes, about the deeper hierarchy.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
There are two things about the deeper hierarchy, and you could say, well, authorization is the domain that it's in, so maybe the hierarchy makes sense since RBAC is abbreviated and people may not know what it means, which maybe suggests to me that it shouldn't be RBAC. But
yeah, we had ABAC and RBAC, and so that was ABAC predates this as well. So
no, I'm just saying the acronym. If people cannot understand the acronym, that maybe we should not have used the acronym. But effectively, the pattern we were shooting for is, first of all, things that were concise because we don't want to make it too cumbersome. Although, now that we have so many extensions, I guess we did feel is necessary to clarify the scope with .k8s.io. That's fine. I just want to make sure we have really clear guidance. So my personal feeling is that conveying the domain is the most important thing, and the architecture of how that is implemented is a less important thing for users of that API to actually have to be concerned about. So I don't want to get into that pattern. I think we may need to make a rule saying that you shouldn't have things from multiple layers of the architectural layer cake in the same group, because we may want to split those out architecturally in the future.
Yeah, that relates to my next point actually, which is anything that's in a group by itself can be easily homed to go from a CRD to an API server. Anything that is mixed in with a group, it's much more difficult to rehome. And so,
but I really don't want to go to the place where every API is in its own group. That defeats the purposes of group.
I think from your layer point though, like if you can keep your group small as necessary without being too small, I think was really just what I was getting at.
Sure. So anyway, before I consent to have this PR approved, I need someone to actually, whatever our decision is about the guidance, to actually go create a PR to the API conventions so that this kind of question just answers itself next time. Like every time in the past where I've asked for this. Well, not every time. Like Jordan's pretty good about going to document this. I think that was Jordan that was going to speak up. So if Jordan says he'll do it, I'll believe him. But anybody else, I'll say, before this PR gets merged, we have to go update the API conventions.
I actually kind of agree that pinning the API to the admission mechanism is a little odd. Like if we in the future came up with a different way other than admission where we would apply these policies, we would be stuck with this mechanism in the API group.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I think that should be mechanism free.
Yes.
It's about
Okay.
the concept, the simplest representation of the core concept scoped under Kate's.io.
Did we want to partition these by SIG?
No.
No.
So the direction we're going in a separate discussion, which I don't have time to get into today because I have to leave at 9 as well, is we're creating a formal notion of subproject. Well, I have to read Aaron's last message to see if he still agrees with me. But so the hierarchy will be there's SIG, and under SIGs there can be multiple subprojects, and those subprojects, regardless of what they're named, they have some domain. The domain is what should be the name of the group. Users should not have to care about SIGs or components. Like those are implementation details in the code and in the community, and users should not have to bear that conceptual burden.
Yeah, that's a fair argument. I guess the counter argument might be one. If you're using a particular API group, it's kind of handy to kind of know who's in charge of it. And secondly, it makes the ownership of naming a little more distributed in that we don't have to have a central committee approving these things in what is essentially a global namespace.
Well, we do have to have a global namespace though. Like the reality is there is a global namespace, and there are actually at least one list and probably multiple lists checked in to the code base. That doesn't mean there needs to be central approval unless there's an escalation like this, like that the convention is not clear.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand the arguments in both directions. It's not totally clear to me that one of them is obviously better than the other.
Well, the shard, if you want completely distributed, that's the domain, right? Like, don't choose .kds.io if you don't want to be in the central list in the Kubernetes repo.
So I agree. I think back to early times at Google when there was actually a single person, Marissa at the time, who was in charge for the top level URLs and making sure that things didn't get out of control when Google itself was exploding. It feels like that. I think having some group, probably the API folks, that has like, hey, if you pick this name, there's a good chance that people will confuse it with this other concept. I mean, it's too easy to actually sort of pick names that are going to be really confusing when you're looking at the whole platform. So having some level of approval for that global namespace to me seems like a must.
I know when we were trying to come up with this name, we were looking at the other types of policy we had. So network policy is under network Kate's.io. I think some of the scheduler policy stuff is under just the policy group, possibly, which seems not differentiated enough.
Exactly. So that's a place where somebody picked something that was a little bit too broad.
Yeah. So like the network policy living under network Kate's.io, that makes sense to me. I like that. We were having a difficult time figuring out sort of a corresponding signifier that captured what this was policying.
Yeah, that's another perhaps argument for hierarchy where, policy within the network subnamespace is reasonably self-explanatory, and policy within the storage namespace would, the word policy is the same, but it clearly means different things, and it's pretty obvious what the distinction is.
Maybe some of the difficulty is this is a policy around pods, which don't exist in a group, and we've never had to come up with a name of a group for pods. Like if we came up with storage related policy, if that went under storage kits.io, that would make sense to me. I'm not sure what to call this.
Is there a reason why we would not put this in the policy API group? Like, we can argue about whether the name is good or not, but it exists. And that is a policy that also relates to pods. That is also, I think, sort of at the same architectural layer.
There's certainly a fetishism around creating new groups. I mean, I think that's a reasonable argument that we collapse onto the thing we already have. The pod disruption budget is more people probably would use pod security policy than pod disruption budget.
That's fine.
Do we have a really strong reason to separate them? I can't think of one.
Are they, I mean, pod disruption budget's still beta, right?
Yeah. That gets into sparse groups, which
we already have.
Yeah, which we already have.
Well, this API is also beta, or it's going to GA?
It is still beta. We were planning to groupify it in a corresponding beta version and then promote to V1 from that beta version. So we don't make any structural changes on the way to a group.
And we think it will go to V1 before pod disruption budget. All other things being equal.
I would expect probably to do V1 in 1.11 if we can make the group change in 1.10. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the timeline for pod disruption budget.
Okay.
If it goes in the policy group alongside pod disruption budget, that doesn't seem like the worst outcome to me. That seems okay. That does seem like it would kind of become a magnet for undifferentiated policy, but if we try to be judicious about, like, is this a different subsystem? Is this a network subsystem or volume or storage subsystem? Then go into those groups. Then this can kind of be the policy for pods and things in the core API group, maybe, that don't have a clear other home. I'm not sure. I think honestly, with the ability to do admission webhooks and call out for other arbitrary policy, we will hopefully see less fixed declarative policy in tree.
So the just in terms of curiosity about how soon we expect like a V2 alpha 1 of pod security policy, do you think we're going to have to make drastic changes to it for Windows?
For Windows, we already have sort of single environment things like AppArmor and SE Linux in there. I would expect some of the Windows related things to parallel that. I think it's more likely that any drastic changes would be around the discussion around per container policy, like for injected containers. That conversation scares me a little bit.
Are there other, so if we created a group that was around security policies, and we do have some which you can squint and they're kind of security related, like network policy, although it's a little bit less direct. But would there be other kinds of policies that we would want to create around security, but it makes sense to create a security policy group?
Well, I think we're probably going to introduce application network security policy. I don't know if that will be part of network policy or it's a separate idea. But that's definitely something. And then the other.
What do you mean by application network security policy? Stuff like what the Calico folks are doing, the Tigera folks are doing?
Or based on application identity, like pod identity?
Yeah, effectively. Yeah, instead of, yeah, exactly.
That's like
Joe.
That's a long
Anyway,
discussion. I actually think that that's a totally different layer. I don't think
Okay.
that's something that Kubernetes should implement, but like I
So-
think
And
that's
then
a totally
the
different
other piece is
namespace.
things like if we want to surface
Okay.
virtualized computers.
So what I'm going to ask for actually is I'm going to say, sorry, I'm going to punt this back and say the guidance is it needs to be a domain .kds.io, one word, no deeper hierarchy. Don't include the mechanism, don't include the SIG or subproject. And don't name it after the resource itself. Like pod security policy is too narrow. Like we could never add another thing to this group if it were called that. And I don't want to set that as a precedence that people should name it resource dot something. That's too confusing.
Okay.
So, you know, think of some alternatives and we'll come back. I'll, you know, if you can think of some alternatives today, I will try to look at it tomorrow and we can try to see if we like any of those alternatives better. Like I don't want to bike shed on it indefinitely, but I'm really concerned about the precedent this would set.
That's good feedback. Thanks.
But just to be clear, I mean, the advice that you've just given about no hierarchy and one word and all of that stuff, it's not clear to me that we have consensus on that in this group. I mean, as a one-off, you know, to unblock this thing, it seems reasonable, but it doesn't sound like that is the advice we've agreed upon.
In the sense of what disagreement is there?
Well, I mean, there seem to be some voices saying there should be groupings, and you know, network was one of them, and storage was another one, security was another one. You know, whether those are aligned directly with SIGs is still a question. But
I think it's the guidance for this particular object, where we have one top-level object, and we're trying to figure out, should we start a new group to contain exactly one object? Something like RBAC, where you have a collection of like 6 different top-level types, I think the nesting still can make sense, but we want to avoid single object groups.
Yeah. No, I understand. I just want to make sure that we're talking about a one-off thing here for a somewhat special case.
Yeah, so can we treat this as the first example, and then this is a part of case law, and then the second and third examples will help us formalize this into final case law? Is that sufficient, Quentin, to your point?
Well, we have a list of a bunch of groups, and I'm not super happy with, you know, all of them. Obviously, we've changed direction multiple times, and you know, in order to move fast, it just grew organically. So we have tons of examples. I don't know how many more examples we really need. I think RBAC.authorization could have been different. I mean, it could have been spelled out a little bit more, right? Like role-based authorization or RB authorization or something, right? Like it didn't have to be nested. Authorization is kind of part of the domain, but the way it's written, it's hierarchical, which I don't want to get into, and it sounds like it's associated with mechanism rather than domain, right? So it's kind of muddled the intent of the convention, which, you know, admittedly was not well documented. So I want to just make sure that we have a clear precedent. I think the outstanding question is like the network policy being in the network grouping okay to have policy resources and implementation of lower levels of the stack in the same group just because they're in a related domain. So I think that is maybe a fair question that's still open. You know, with respect to the SIG thing, yes, every one of these groups should be owned by some subproject of some SIG. Like it shouldn't be overlapping multiple SIGs, but the name of the SIG absolutely 100% should not be in the name. Like we should not be you know, having the structure of the code and community groups of the project be so obvious to users. Yes, Conway law, everybody understands Conway law exists, but people shouldn't deeply understand how the mechanics of the project itself works, like the sausage making, in order to eat the sausage, right?
So to respect the time box, it's 12. We're probably going to lose a lot of people here momentarily, including you, Brian. Do we have enough people present to discuss the remaining things on the agenda, or do we need to table these and adjourn early? Thoughts, Joe, others?
I'm happy to keep going, but I don't know if we have critical mass. What else is on the agenda?
So just a quick
Yeah.
question to clarify Clayton's point, since he actually added it to the agenda.
You wanted clarification what it was?
Yes.
So in SIG Apps, we were talking about something called application, and there was an argument put forward that it would be easier to get consensus by putting it into the core API as an alpha than it would be as a CRD. I was a little skeptical of that because I felt like that means that CRDs aren't doing a good job of coming up with their own process of, the concern would be like, we go do this CRD and then people have to migrate. If they want to migrate, if we want to make this a core API, it would be migrate costs. That's a while out no matter what, but I feel like that kind of points to, we haven't really thought about that. We might want to be thinking about that going forward in order to prevent people from feeling like in order to make progress, they have to do a core API. It is putting ourselves first in some cases where we're like, oh, we can put this in core because I can talk to the SIG and get consensus, but it then puts us in a model where then we have to go legislate a bunch of stuff on a per decision basis. We want teams to be empowered, but.
So that's a good thing that maybe we should get that added to the GA criteria for CRD. But I also think it's a question of what does being in core mean with respect to that? Obviously what is core even, but if we wanted it auto-registered by default, for example, could it still be implemented as a CRD?
Yeah, it was really whether doing the CRD, because we don't have versioning for it, it was going to cause us a problem. We did want to move it. And I think there's a good set of arguments that if CRDs aren't good enough, we have to make CRDs good enough anyway. So
I would actually make the suggestion that if the controller that uses a resource is not part of core, then the resource itself is not part of core. I think if we look at ingress, I think, ingress just being a pure schema and nothing else, with the advent of CRDs, we would have done it differently today than back then.
Same applies for network policy.
Yeah, and I think it does, right? And so, I mean, obviously we need to keep moving CRDs forward so that they can hit all the check marks. But I think, this push to like make the application definition thing core, I don't know why it ever needs to be.
Yeah. I think we are coupling core with easy to develop against right now in a lot of people's minds, and that's a learning thing that I feel like we can do a better job of communicating and supporting people who take a little bit of short-term pain for a longer term of happy ecosystem.
And I think it's totally acceptable for us to say, here's the set of CRDs that are expected to be, part of a cluster that meets profile X. You don't have to install those. I mean, it's similar to like, necessary add-ons, like you have to have DNS, right? Like, or stuff breaks, but you really don't have to have DNS, but really you do, right? I mean, we could have a set of CRDs that are in the same boat.
Yeah, and DNS is required. That ship has sailed.
You could run a limited cluster in an embedded situation that doesn't have DNS if you really don't want to.
Sure, it doesn't necessarily have to pass conformance tests.
It won't pass conformance. Yeah, I mean, like, just to be clear, right? So.
Yeah, so people can
It's the difference between user mode on Android versus user mode on desktop Linux, right? They're both Linux, but
and
like really.
I've accepted the fact that people will just go use kubelet, and that's fine. And we should make that work eventually once we get other problems behind us. Anyway, I have to run. Thanks. Yeah. So Jordan, if you can come up with some ideas and ping me by Slack.
Sure.
And then we need to try to get this guidance checked in so we get fewer of these questions over time. More obvious to what they need to do.
I'll comment on the issue and come back. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. All right, so who's left?
Time zones and cron jobs.
Yeah, time zone, cron jobs. Okay.
So here's the thing. Some time ago, there was a proposal to be able to specify a time zone when you schedule a cron job. I was reviewing the features that we want to land for SIG apps last week, and this struck me again because from the beginning, I was a little bit reluctant to the idea of having any kind of notion of time zones in a cron job. Currently, if you specify a cron job, you just specify it has to run based on a regular cron, like you do in Linux. But apparently, there are users, not that many as well, that are interested in being able to specify a time zone when the job will be actually triggered. But the problem with that, there are several problems. First of all, none of the times that we represent in the cluster is in any way time zone dependent. It's always one and only single time for everything, every time related information that we present in the cluster. So that would be one precedence where we allow users to do something else, but then again, the information about the job being created and everything around it would be still presented in a non-time zone dependent way. The other issue is that if we decide to include the time zones, actually, that will force the distributions to actually ship with a time zone database, which is a problem by itself, again, knowing how huge problematic time zones in general are in every single programming language and for every single administrator out there. So I brought this topic on Monday's SIG apps, and the outcome was that nobody much complained if I would be interested in rejecting it. I talked with Clayton. I talked with several other people, and they are in the majority supporting rejecting that pull request. I haven't heard from anyone who will be interested in actually having the time zones. So the question to the SIG architecture is about the direction with this kind of a requests.
Boy, my gut says this is a terrible idea and it should be rejected. But that's just me.
Not running the same on different clusters or in different environments, or when someone bumps a PR to raise an image in Cube and then half the clusters in the world change time zones and the other half don't, like, terrifies me beyond all measure.
Yeah. I mean, I get the use case partly because if you have federated clusters across multiple time zones, let's say you want to run an EOD job or an EOD ETL job that runs at 5 o'clock, to sum up the day's work, and you've got multi-cloud. You've got an EMA job that needs to run at a certain time and another. I mean, how do you?
Yeah, I mean, those were all the use cases presented. I think the fact that you can accomplish this from the outside, and some of this was discussed in the issue. If you want daylight savings time based runtime, well, you can annotate those cron jobs and then have a controller that you write that has its own daylight savings time database that you provide that goes and sets the runtime. It's possible. I think it's difficult to require every distribution to provide all the databases and things required to support it in core.
So I'm going to jump in here, though, because from the outside looking in, as somebody who says, all right, I want to go do that, you just said go write a controller. Now I'm going to go out and find somebody who is actually capable of writing a controller. And I'm probably only going to find a handful of people who even know where to find the docs are today, and maybe a handful more who've done it. It's really hard to find people who are comfortable doing what you just described. That's a really high barrier to entry. That's not something you can ask your average app operator to go do. That's hard.
So when we say write a controller, we don't mean that anybody who wants to do this needs to write a controller, just meaning that this can be done on the outside. It can start as like a sub project. We can suss out all those issues. But if this wants to be like it doesn't have to be like everybody writes their own controller. It just means that an outside controller can do this. People can install it. They can read the caveats. They can understand the subtleties as they're installing this extra controller.
Yeah, one person in the world can write a controller, publish it, and say, annotate your cron jobs this way, and run this controller that we've provided. Like, not everyone has to write.
Arguably, the same person who wrote the PR, who cares so much, they're capable of changing Kubernetes. There are
and if a year from now we discover that, hey, there's one controller that everybody's using, and all these issues that we've like gotten afraid about around time zones are really unfounded, you know, the time database, then maybe it's like, okay, screw it, let's just move it into core.
All right, so we don't just want to close this. We want to encourage the person to carry out the innovation outside of core, to try to suss out the issues, to distribute it that way. We want to be able to have a solution we can point to in the meantime, and we want to encourage the person to go do this and give them this kind of overall path forward, rather than saying we're not going to do it here because it's a bad idea.
Right, and if that is done under SIG apps and like using our new sort of like if that's a new repo that is chartered by SIG apps, I think, you know, that's not all locked down and figured out yet. In my mind, that's totally acceptable to actually have sort of a meet place for people to play with, sussing out these issues.
We want to be careful in the phrasing. It's not a promise that this will be pulled into core if it works well. It's a statement that you can accomplish what you want to accomplish built on top of core without putting these additional requirements on core.
Yeah, and I think we want to encourage people to do that and
Absolutely.
point out and help them figure out how to go do that. So I like the idea. I do.
Yeah. Who amongst us is willing to take on the burden of updating that with this discussion?
Okay,
Matt, you seem closest. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it is SIG apps and it's come up there, and I'm already on the issue, so I can go in if nobody else wants to.
That would be awesome. Great. I didn't feel strong enough in my English to properly and nicely say, no, you can't have it. I'm a simple.
Yeah, I think there is, you know, the whole incubation process has taught us, though, is that we don't want to promise that, hey, this is a sort of, you know, on rail sort of path to getting stuff in core. Just, you know, say, hey, if this can be done outside, let's do it outside. You know, under certain circumstances, this may pave the way to moving stuff to core, but that's on a sort of case by case basis.
Yeah, and proof that it's stable enough, that it's working reasonably, because from our experience, time related data is super hard. I haven't seen a person happy with time handling in anywhere. So
yes.
Yeah, and I can relate. I wrote a distributed. Yeah.
I'm trying to protect myself from having like gazillions of cron job time zones related issues. I'd rather fix the controller itself rather than the time zone related stuff around it.
Yeah, and I can relate to this. I wrote a distributed calendaring app years ago and had to deal with time zones and distributed, and I never want to do it again. But I do notice something here. Maybe if I can pick at one other little thing in this is, you know, this is two issues we've talked about today about start outside and bring it in. There's the CRD to moving something into core, and now this. And it's a common theme we've kind of talked about. Has this been really communicated well out to SIGs and other places that we just start to see this conversation happening here thinking this way, but are we communicating our thinking out to others, and is this really what we're thinking? Because I keep seeing a pattern of this.
We've been talking about this probably for 6 months to a year. I mean, this was a big topic at the leadership offsite. Was that like a year ago now, something like that? It's something that we've been talking about again and again and again. I think, you know, finding new ways to get this message out there. But the whole idea around, you know, the layer diagrams that Brian's been talking about, this idea of you know, prioritizing extensibility points over new features in core. I mean, that has been a very, very consistent theme. And I'm honestly, I'm kind of confused that you hadn't heard that, because I feel like we've been beating that horse.
I've heard it, but I've heard it, but I keep having to bring it up in other places where others haven't heard it, or they really haven't got the message that it's for real. And that's the thing. I hear it all the time, but it's a lot of other people I run into who aren't in this meeting, which is just a handful of people who are the usual suspects who don't seem to realize that. And that's what I was asking.
In my mind, our ability to actually make that real hinges on our ability to say no, and our ability to say no to things is only over the last couple of months has really gotten to the point where, with the steering committee, with a certain amount of legitimacy behind SIGs like this one, we finally have the ability to in a real way say no where we didn't have before. And so I think that's why you're starting to see these conversations come up again and again, because we expressed the desire before, but we really didn't have the right mechanisms to really force the issue and make that happen. That's changed now.
You know, I've run into this buzzsaw myself now a few times, and this is something I'm hoping the steering committee will find a way to address, is that the authority of SIGs seems fine until you try and go out and propagate something in the wild, and then suddenly it turns into a melee, and we need some sort of way of avoiding that sort of churn that happens every time something process changes. Because this sort of thing is, we all feel confident that there's consensus, we've talked about it, there's open opportunities, there's videos, I mean, everything under the sun, but then you get out and discuss it in the wild and people are like, wait, what? And this is a really serious problem. This is going to block our velocity in a lot of different ways unless we solve how to get this information out. And
I think fundamentally it's a communication problem. And so, some of the Contrib X stuff, like I've been trying to push, and I'm going to write a cap on it on a community site, really sort of motivating that. Caps themselves are one way to communicate this, but Aaron has run into this buzzsaw, right? Aaron? You know this well.
A website is not the solution to a communication problem. It's clear and consistent messaging. It would be helpful to have a document to point to that you can refer people to, and I would maybe attempt to ask somebody here to answer Matt Farina's question in that regard. It could be something that dovetails nicely with this whole idea of categorizing the project into core, not core associated. And along with that, you talk about how cool it is that you can do all this stuff outside of core, so it's not really that big a deal that you're not core. I think I've heard I was in the SIG API machinery session at KubeCon. It was a totally packed room where the messaging of start with CRDs definitely came out there. Unless you care about versioning, then you can't do the CRD thing outside of core. So the message is getting out in small piecemeal ways, but it's about like a consistent talking point documented somewhere to make sure everybody's kind of saying the same thing.
Do we need major position papers or something, some sort of way of saying this is the direction we're going on in core, out core? Like, I mean, the thing is, I feel like Brian has poured so much blood into this well. I'm surprised he has any blood left in him after doing all the work on this stuff. It's like there seems to be no level of communication that's good enough.
I would maybe agree with Joe that we're actually making decisions now. We are sort of building up this body of case law. But I think, we had everybody kind of communicate no more new features in the leadership summit last year, and this community takes time to change. So there are those of us who feel like we've been saying this over and over, but I think to Matt's point, this is about newcomers who haven't been hearing this over and over. Being able to point them to a documented on-ramp would be helpful.
And I think, right now, so much of our, Brian's been doing a lot of stuff one-on-one. The stuff that he does write, I think it gets lost in a pile of markdown that's spread across, 12 different repos. So I do think we have an information architecture problem that we don't even have the canonical place to go to look at sort of, what's happening and sort of what are the decisions, and, it's really everywhere. And, a lot of this stuff is hidden in feature issues, that are almost not discoverable. So something's got to change there. I mean, in terms of the way we do wide communication, and there's no silver bullet, but I think over time we can start to actually have the canonical places to look, the canonical ways to communicate, make things look official, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. It's not an easy problem, though.
Yeah. I thought it was super cool that Anthony, got up on stage at KubeCon, and one of the keynotes was about look at Kube Meta Controller. You don't even have to write Go code to write your own custom controller to do your own custom bit of functionality. So I think we're messaging that particular point piecemeal here and there for sure about the power and extensibility of Kubernetes and how core really is solidifying, and there's so much you can do outside of core. It's just reinforcing that and making sure we do kind of have it documented. But I maybe I'm agreeing with Jason's point. You don't necessarily have to have a full-on policy document every single time, but I feel like we're getting to the point where enough case law is building up. I want to make sure there's a clear and consistent document you can point newcomers to TLDR instead of having to have them show up to this meeting all the time.
Well, I mean, this may be the most naive, weird suggestion of all time, but how does the legal profession handle this? How do they distill case law in a way that is actually searchable? Maybe we need to do something like that.
So what they do is they compile it into books, and you subscribe to LexisNexis, and it costs you thousands of dollars a year. And there's whole companies that are built up around cross-indexing and actually deriving themes out of this stuff.
And then you hire a lawyer to understand said case law. So we're going to create a profession of Kubernetes open source.
Well, we've been wondering about how do we include lawyers in this process, because every OSS needs lawyers. Perfect. Let's put that.
No, but I think some of this is that we do need something like a LexisNexis for some of our stuff, because again, it's it's spread everywhere. I think if we do have some index that pulls this stuff together, that at least, I don't know, I think that fills a gap. It's not the whole solution though.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be big cases, essentially the Brown versus the Board of Education type decisions that we document and make it clear that these are the way in which we're adjudicating in any given situation. For example, if you come to us with a new addition to core, here's the things that you should probably review as things that we've rejected in the past, so you have an idea if you're likely to get even rejected or not.
So, I mean, to Matt's point, he's noticed two things of the same variety in this meeting. I would maybe think that if we as a group notice the same thing happening meeting after meeting, which we could do by going through the meeting notes and looking at it, we could kind of notice when the same question is being asked too often. But I also think that those who are coming to ask the questions will go back out and talk about their decision, and we can organically spread this message as well.
Yeah.
Matt, does that address your concerns?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know that there is one overall great way to get to the masses, because there are a lot of people who are drive buyers or are there at a little bit of a distance, and I'm not sure the best way. I mean, people have tried it with planets. There's now some of these, and we probably have a weekly thing. If there's something written up that somebody gets thrown to a weekly, there's just all these little ways of communicating out to the masses, and I'm not sure the best way.
So I think, one example to look at might be say the Go project, right? And I'm sure they have a gazillion people every day that want to come in and say, hey, I want to add this new library to the standard libraries. Right, and they're like, no. Maybe you start developing in the Golang/X or whatever the heck that is, and then over time, as that stuff stabilizes, you move it in. And I think to the point, I'm sure there's still people every day that come in and say that. So this isn't going to disappear.
I actually don't know that they do, because very early on they established the way packages work and how you can import other packages, so you wouldn't have to have them in the standard library. And so very early on, they set a precedence of go create your own packages, and created the tooling and shared that tooling with GoGet and things like that people are now building on to get more features in. But they very early on set up pattern and precedence for doing that. And Kubernetes very early on set up kind of a pattern and precedence of do a lot of stuff in core. And I know one of the things that's been brought up is, folks like at Google say, well, I can't go do it elsewhere because I don't have a place that I can contribute, because I got carte blanche with the Kubernetes project, but not elsewhere. So I want to get it in core because it's the only place that I have permission to contribute it. And they're not the only company that are like this. And so now we start to run into different social problems. Yeah.
We're flat out saying don't do that anymore. And we have been saying don't do that anymore for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, it's a good thing that the same question is being asked here, because it means people have finally recognized this is a place to ask those sorts of questions and have decisions happen.
Yeah.
No, yeah. We can probably move on from the communications thing because we've only got 5 minutes left. Was there anything else? I just asked a question. I didn't expect you to eat up that much time.
No, this is important. There's nothing else in the agenda. I don't know.
So I must have I added some bullet points to something that must have meant something totally different. I just wanted to let this group know that I've started implementing the whole concept of sub-projects and how they're assigned to SIGs. I created an issuing community and I tagged it with the steering committee. I guess I ought to go ahead and tag it with SIG Architecture too. Let me do that right now using this handy dandy bot. And I created a strawman implementation where formatting is hard. I'm trying not to slime like changing the formatting of the entire README just to accommodate this new set of information. But if you have any thoughts on either the content of the sub-projects that I assigned based on the spreadsheet that Brian Grant took a first pass at, so this would have been all the repos under Kubernetes, Kubernetes Incubator, or Kubernetes Helm. I just assumed that there was an owner's file there and then assigned that to SIG based on his designation. And then at Matt's suggestion, I also just took a complete guess at what the Workloads API project might look like from the perspective of which owner's files encompass all of the code that has to do with the workload APIs. So we have some straw men of what this would look like from both its presence in a machine-readable YAML file and in README files that people can go look at when they have questions like Helm, what's the Helm subproject? Who does that belong to? What's this workload API subproject? I think that's all I got.
Okay. Great, thank you. I guess that's time. As always, appreciate everybody's attendance and involvement in this discussion, and I will see you in a week.
One last thing I did want to say, I'm excited. We're starting to see KEPs come in. That's really great. We have subdirectories so that SIGs can move. Let's, this seems like the right baby steps there. So I'd love, send me any feedback offline about that, but I feel like we're making some positive progress there. So that's exciting.
Thanks, Joe. All right, everybody. See you later. Have a great day.